And listen, just quickly before we go to Kevin Donnelly, who's got his new book, Cancel Culture, we'll talk about. Has the fight back finally begun, do you think, James? Two events this week offer hope: the resignation of a teacher and the withdrawal of a child from an expensive private school because of this critical race theory. Tell us about these two stories, James.
Yeah, well, look, very quickly before we get to Kevin Donnelly, we've had a couple of things here. Number one, we've had a teacher resign from a very posh private school in New York, and he says that he couldn't take the indoctrination of his students anymore. But I wanted to read a bit of a letter that another parent from another very posh girls' school called Brearley in Manhattan wrote, and he wrote this long, open letter, and he said, "Our family recently made the decision not to re-enroll our daughter at Brearley for the 2021-22 school year." He said, "I object to the view that I should be judged by the color of my skin." He's talking about how the whole school has gone completely woke, critical race theory. "I cannot tolerate a school that not only judges my daughter by the color of her skin, but encourages her and to prejudge others by theirs. By viewing every element of education, every aspect of history, and every facet of society through the lens of skin color and race, we are desecrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and utterly violating the movement for which such civil rights leaders believed, fought, and died." And he goes on and on. It's a brilliant indictment. It's a real, I think, almost a historic document, just nailing the colors to the mast against critical race theory. It's at the Barry Weiss website, BARIWEISS Substack site, which you can Google. It's absolutely brilliant. Read the whole thing. This should be the catch cry for parents, for people working in corporate Australia, corporate America, anywhere where they're confronted with this nonsense, because it lays out the case beautifully.
And once, of course, James and Rita, once someone steps forward like this, then others can follow. Other teachers can step down. Other parents can withdraw their kids from these schools and these lessons. It's up to us as individuals to do it, and I reckon it's starting, finally. Joining us now is a good friend of Outsiders, Kevin Donnelly, whose new book is out, Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March. Kevin, it's great to see you. I'm sure you've been following these stories. You've been chronicling the Long March through the institutions and warning about it since the John Howard years. Alas, you were ignored, and we are now paying the price. How does cancel culture tie in with the Marxist march through our institutions, Kevin?
If I go back in history, it goes back to the 1920s in Germany. Very quickly, there was a Frankfurt school where a number of Marxist academics, they realised that the revolution would never occur in the West, as it did in Russia. So they began to get involved in what they called the culture wars, which was about taking the Long March. If you can infiltrate and take control of trade unions, of universities, of education, of the media, and we see examples every day, you mentioned a couple just previously. If the left can take control, then they're able to win the debate. And my concern, and I've been writing about this since the mid-90s, is that unless conservatives enter the public square, enter the debate, get involved in what John Howard called the battle of ideas, then we've already lost. So I'm somebody who's really been looking at this, as others have, over the last 30, 40 years. I think there are positive signs that the tide might be turning, but as we say, we have to be eternally vigilant.
Rita?
Well, I'm not sure the tide is turning, because we've got conservative governments who don't want to have the battle of ideas, the ideological culture wars, whatever you want to call it. We've seen Scott Morrison, for example, be very clear that that's not a priority for him, Kevin.
You're right, and it's no secret that I was Chief of Staff to Kevin Andrews during the Howard years. John Howard, Tony Abbott when Prime Minister. We had two PMs then who were very much aware of what was happening and didn't always get into the battle, but they were there staking the territory to a degree. But when I say I'm a bit more positive, when you look at even President Obama came out, I think, last year, saying that cancel culture, this idea of identity politics, victimhood, is going too far. So when you've got somebody like Obama, more recently Barry Weiss,
but isn't that just because? Isn't that, Kevin, just because they're going after the left now, and even Barack Obama's getting caught up. I mean, it's not any embrace of free speech or libertarian values that's behind that sentiment. It's because the lunatic left is now so fringe that even the lefties are getting caught up in this cancel culture.
You're right, Rita, and if you look at the history of the Communist Party, especially in Russia, they tend to eat their own if they can't get their own way, and they often resort to violence to do that. But, when I look at the book that has just come out, there are a number of very good authors there. The fact that that book can now be published, that there are some universities that will establish the Centre for Western Civilization. You've got even people like Noam Chomsky in America arguing that the left has gone too far. So I think we haven't won the debate, and that's certainly the case. And there's a lot more to be done. But what I believe is that people are becoming more aware of the issue, and instead of looking at the problem, we're now starting to argue, well, what is the solution? What can we do to address this?
James.
Well, I want to say, Kevin, I've been enjoying the book. I've got it right here. I've been enjoying the essays in it, but I want to ask you about one of them in particular, one by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, about how COVID-19 has been used as an excuse to basically amp up not only cancel culture, but basically the war against our personal freedoms. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what he's talking about what you think about how COVID-19 and this pandemic has affected this this sort of cultural fight that we're in?
When Tony Abbott agreed to write the chapter, he mentioned it would be about COVID. And I thought at the time, well, I'm not too sure of that. But in fact, I write regularly for the Conservative Woman in London. And at that time, there was a great deal of reaction against what Boris was doing in London. People were afraid of losing their freedoms, of what was taken for granted in terms of the liberty to live your own life, to take responsibility, not to have government impose. That was starting to heat up, and Tony Abbott was aware of that. And so if you read the chapter in the book, he's very concerned that Conservatives have given way, Conservative governments in particular, and they've allowed fear to take control, which, as we know, is one way that the left always try and manipulate people, that if they can use fear, if they can indoctrinate people, and we see that with George Orwell in Big Brother 1984. So the chapter that Tony Abbott's written is a very worthwhile one, because it's a warning to Conservatives that the minute you allow government to step over the line, the minute you allow government to take control, it's very rare that they'll ever stand back. And the liberties and freedoms we take for granted, whether it's freedom of expression, whether it's freedom of movement, whether it's freedom simply to take responsibility, all of that has been weakened, and especially in Victoria, unfortunately, where you even have a pregnant woman in Shepparton being arrested by the police for simply posting something on social media.
Absolutely. Kevin Donnelly, Cancel Culture. We'll put the book up on the screen there. If people want to buy it, which I urge them to, best way to do so is go to kevindonnelly.com.au and you can buy the book there. Kevin, thanks for coming on Outsiders, and keep up the great work.
Always a pleasure.